Hey and welcome back. Regular viewers of my channel will probably recognise most of these tools. We've got the square thread taps, which I made a few months ago, as well as the big fly cutter, the tap handle, and the two-piece split vise and the V-jaws. Now whilst I was making these tools, I had a few people ask me what exactly I was planning on making with all this stuff, and the answer is, I'm going to be making a Flypress. Now if you don't know what a Flypress is, I don't exactly blame you. You're more likely to find one of those in a blacksmith shop than a machine shop. But all it is essentially a screw-driven press, as opposed to say an arbor press or maybe a hydraulic press. We'll have a lead screw, which will drive a ram block, and that will drive the ram block downwards and give us our downwards force. Now something like this is commonly referred to as a screw press, but what makes a fly press special is that it has a flywheel, which helps create momentum. Combine that with a very coarse lead screw, and the result is you're going to get a very large impact force, which will do most of our work. A normal screw press doesn't exactly rely on momentum. Now the reason for this project is simply, I don't currently have a press, and I've been needing one for quite some time. I think some people get the impression that because I have a lathe and a milling machine, that this is somehow a fully kitted out workshop, but that just isn't the case. For most of my life, the workshop that I had access to was just a small tin garden shed with some old tools. The lathe and the milling machine are very recent additions. And one tool we never needed was a press. I mean, occasionally we did use the vise as a press, but it's just too sloppy of a fit to do any precision work. Now I did consider just buying an off-the-shelf arbor press. They can be had for about $100 to $200, but I think a Flypress would be a more versatile tool, and we should be able to get a lot more force out of the Flypress. A screw easily beats a rack and pinion. I also looked at simply buying an old Flypress, but it's probably no surprise that these are not a common tool, and the ones that I did find were either in the wrong state, or they were too large for my workshop. And that brings us back to the tools. I knew this was going to be a very ambitious project, which would require a few specialised pieces of tooling in order to make it. So I had to make those tools before I could even attempt to make the Flypress, so thanks for being patient with me whilst I made those tools, and hopefully you'll be able to see them all in action in the next few videos. And that brings us to the materials. Now normally a Flypress is a single casting of steel, but unfortunately I can't do that here. So instead I'm going to have to settle with a lot of welded up and bolted together pieces. What I was mostly able to find was low carbon steel. I have a few pieces of 50mm thick plate, what's that, 2 inches, and that'll form mostly the base, and I also have some 75mm bar stock for the frame. All in all, I have about 50 kilos of metal here, and that doesn't include the flywheel. Now all of this is definitely overkill for a press of this size, but I want it to be as rigid as I can possibly get it, at least within the bounds of the design that I went with. I'll also be referring to a simple SolidWorks model that I drew up. It's undergone a few basic stress simulations just to make sure it didn't break in half the second I started to use it, and I'll talk about the design and the reasons for the design throughout the video. With all that said, nothing else to do but start to make it. Now the first thing I'm going to make is the base. I think once I do that, I think I can build everything up from there. Now the main bulk of it is going to be this 300 by 150 by 50mm piece of plate. It's definitely big enough for the base, and it should be solid enough, but I wouldn't mind it if it was just a little bit wider. A bit more space on each side will help me lay out parts, and it should allow me to add some T-slots, which I can use to fixture parts down. So what I'll do is I'll get this piece of 50mm bar stock that's a little bit smaller, and I'll simply cut it in half, and then weld a strip on each side of the base. Now for some reason the parts weren't coming apart. I tried to hacksaw it and nothing seemed to work. What I soon realised though was I hadn't done my angle grinding all that straight, and the two pieces were attached by a thin piece of metal. Now I could have finished it off very quickly with a hacksaw, but a set of cold chisels made quick work of it. And there we go. Yeah, that definitely wasn't straight. The edges are left pretty rough, so I'll get them both in the milling machine and clean them up. I'll do the first few passes with the face mill to remove a bulk of the material, and then I'll follow it up with a fly cutter to leave a much nicer finish. And that is the sides cleaned up. I think the extra width that it adds to the base makes it look a lot nicer than it did before, although it does look a little bit too blocky now. So what I'll do is I'll add a bit of taper towards the back. And the taper that I settled on was about 15 to 16 degrees. Now I don't have an angle block in that range, so I'll simply make one from an old piece of offcut. And the end result makes the base look a lot better than it did before. Now I could leave it like this, but what I would like to do is round off that front edge of the base. Purely aesthetic, but I think it would make it look a lot better. Now this would be a lot easier with a CNC machine, but it's nothing that I can't do with the grinder and a lot of discs. And that is looking a lot better than it did before. Certainly not perfect, but I really like the look. And whilst I have the grinder and the part, I'll quickly add some bevels for welding. And that's the pieces all ready to go. Now I haven't made the bevels here too big because I'm just not expecting them to be subjected to a huge amount of force. That'll be mostly taken up by the middle piece, and that's just a solid piece of 50mm bar stock. Now this assembly is a little bit big for any of my clamps, so I'll quickly tack it together and then make sure that it hasn't moved, and then I'll fully weld it up. I should note though that this was my first time welding anything as thick as this, and I was learning as I was going along. Now as I understood it, a piece this thick should have been subjected to a bit of a preheat before I started welding, but without a steel table, I think that would have been a little bit difficult. Nothing else left to do but try my best and see if it works. And after finishing the welds, I gave it overnight to cool down. The next morning, well, let's just say those welds are only welds that a mother could love. Thankfully though, I have just the tool for these types of welds. So with all that done, let's get it loaded into the milling machine and we can start to machine the rest of the features. Probably won't come as much surprise that this is easily going to be the biggest thing that I've had to mill, or at least mill on this milling machine. It won't fit in the normal machine vise, so I'll quickly swap it out for the 2-piece vise which I made a few months back. As it turns out though, my precision angle grinding wasn't as perfect as I'd been led to believe. I've had to shim one side of the vise jaws to get it to properly clamp. So the first thing I want to do is fly cut the top surface, get us a much nicer and uniform finish. And as much as I like this fly cutter, it's just a little bit too small for a part this big. Now that is a fly cutter. Now the key to this fly cutter is the speeds and the feeds need to be perfect. Too slow and it wobbles around too much, and too fast and the carbide burns up. And what I finally settled on was a high RPM and a very high feed rate. And the result is a very nice finish. And we also get some pretty nice looking chips too. And even with the good feed rate plus coolant, I did go through 1 or 2 cutting edges. And that is a really nice surface finish. And that mostly comes down to having a really good fly cutter, plus having really good inserts. Fingers crossed I don't get it too scratched. With the part now fly cut, we can start to machine the central bore, which is located at the front of the base. Now I don't have any annular cutters on hand. That would have certainly reduced the amount of machining that I would have had to do. So instead I had to drill a hole and then bore it to size. And the purpose of this bore is to allow broaches and punches to go all the way through. Next I'll add 2 holes on each side of the bore, and this will give me a few more options when it comes down to clamping work. I'll also add 2 holes at the back, which will allow for M12 bolts, which will allow me to bolt the Flypress in place. Or I guess, maybe one. There simply isn't enough travel on the table to get to the other one, so I'll have to machine it later. Now the next I need to machine is a cutout for the frame to seat in. That means machining a piece that's 75 by 75. That's a lot of metal, and that would have taken a long time to do, and it would have worn out one of my cutters. So instead of milling all that out, I'll simply drill 20 or so holes around the perimeter, and then cut out the thin tabs. Now people do ask me why I don't do this more often, and the truth is, sometimes it's quicker to use an end mill and mill it all out, but here there's no doubt that it's a lot quicker to simply drill it out. And that's a pretty big piece of metal. That'll go in the scrap pile to be used another day. With the piece now drilled out, I now need to go back and clean up the hole and then bring it to its final size. And if I can, I'd much rather machine this in one go rather than have to flip it halfway through to machine the other side. However, the vise jaw is in the way, and I wouldn't be able to get the end mill in without damaging the jaws. I did consider about swapping the 2-piece vise for a set of clamps, but the T-slots were too close together and I still wouldn't be able to machine either side. But then I remembered that these were actually aluminium soft jaws, and it really didn't matter if I machined into them. I can always flip them or simply replace them. It's what they're for, and I have a bunch of replacements on hand. So I went ahead and machined in a slot in the soft jaws. And whilst I was there, I went ahead and drilled and tapped the jaws to add some clamps. I'll also take advantage of the bore and I'll add a 3rd clamp. I don't want to give the impression that the split vise isn't working. I simply don't want the part to move, and I'll add as many clamps as I can to prevent that from happening. It probably would have been better if I drilled the fixed jaws rather than the soft jaws, but this still seemed to work. With all that done, I can now start to machine the cutout. Final thing left to do is add some T-slots on each side. So once again, I'll get the part set up in the 2-piece vise, although this time with it rotated 90 degrees, and we can now machine in those 2 T-slots. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the base done. I might add a small tab at the front for a third bolt, just to hold it in place, but in terms of machining it on the milling machine, that is the base complete. Overall, I'm really happy with the build so far, but we have a long way to go until we have a fully operational press. So I guess stay tuned for that. I really hope you enjoyed this project so far. It's been an absolute blast planning it. I think it's been in the works since about January, and I'm just so excited to see how it turns out. Thank you very much for watching. See you next week.